There are men whose names alone can shift the direction of entire nations. Karl Reinhardt was one of them. At 38 years old, he was a decorated intelligence officer, a master cryptographer, and the architect behind evacuation routes that existed only in classified documents and hushed conversations. Then, in the spring of 1945, as Germany crumbled under relentless Allied bombardment, Reinhardt walked into the Bavarian Alps. He never came back. The war was collapsing, cities were burning to the ground, and armies were scattering in every direction like panicked animals. But Reinhardt was not like the others. He did not run in fear. He simply vanished. Witnesses reported seeing him near Mittenwald on May 1st, moving quickly along a narrow goat trail with a heavy rucksack and a metal case strapped tight to his side. One witness claimed Reinhardt acknowledged him with a brief nod, his eyes hollow but focused. It was the look of a man who knew exactly where he was going. That was the final confirmed sighting. By the next morning, the trail was completely empty. No footprints remained, no signs of movement, nothing except the distant rumble of artillery fire echoing through the mountain valleys like approaching thunder. Allied forces flooded the area within days. They tore through abandoned barns, destroyed chalets, and blown open tactical bunkers that looked like shattered bones. They discovered uniforms, scattered weapons, and documents abandoned by fleeing soldiers. But they found absolutely nothing related to Reinhardt. His command post had been cleared out entirely, his personal quarters emptied, his identification papers gone, and his body never found. Some people believed he died somewhere in those mountains, consumed by melting snow or crushed beneath a landslide that wiped away every trace of his existence. Others were convinced he escaped into Austria, hitched a ride with smugglers, slipped through the confusion into Italy, and disappeared into South America like countless others before him. But one fact remained impossible to ignore. Reinhardt possessed knowledge that few others had. Not just rumors or loose talk. He knew encrypted communication systems, the locations of experimental research facilities and evacuation protocols designed to survive total invasion. He was far too valuable to just disappear without a trace. And yet that is exactly what happened. For 78 years, his case sat buried in forgotten archives stamped with one word, unresolved, a ghost file, a brief mention in the story of a collapsing empire. But everything was about to change. Somewhere deep in those mountains lay the truth. And in 2023, a group of hikers would finally discover the proof that Karl Reinhardt had never left the Alps at all. In the final days before Karl Reinhardt disappeared, Allied signal units picked up a transmission so broken and unclear that they nearly dismissed it as random interference. But hidden beneath the crackling static, a message kept repeating itself. The voice was monotone, rushed, completely devoid of emotion. A male voice, clearly German, repeating a coded phrase that no one could understand at the time. Sanctuary secured. Contingency plan active. The date was April 29, 1945, exactly 2 days before Reinhardt was seen for the last time. The transmission came from somewhere deep inside the Bavarian Alps, bouncing off towering ridgelines before reaching Allied listening posts. This made pinpointing the exact location almost impossible. The voice sounded flat, exhausted, nearly robotic. But one detail sent chills through the analysts who heard it. The speaker ended the message with a call sign that belonged exclusively to Reinhardt. Then came silence. Not static interference or technical difficulties. Just silence. The radio frequency stayed open for several hours afterward. Nothing else was transmitted. The Allies recorded it, translated what they could, and filed it away among thousands of other intelligence fragments left behind by a crumbling regime. Investigators went back to the transcript later. Sanctuary in the mountains, one section read, distorted but clearly identifiable. Initiate fallback. Contingency plan remains viable. To most intelligence officers listening, it sounded like the desperate ramblings of a broken man. The final words of someone clinging to authority that no longer existed while everything collapsed around him. They dismissed it as panic-driven nonsense, an empty threat, a meaningless broadcast lost in the fog of war. For decades afterward, historians treated it as nothing more than another phantom transmission among countless others. But something about it felt wrong. Something refused to fit neatly into the narrative of chaos and collapse. The coordinates recorded by two separate Allied listening stations pointed to nothing. No known bunker, no supply cache, no fortress, nothing that should have been there. Yet the signal itself was powerful, clear, and transmitted from high-quality radio equipment with perfect line of sight to the valley far below. Whoever sent that broadcast knew exactly what he was doing. He was ready. He was composed. And he genuinely believed he had a plan worth putting into action. What nobody understood at the time, what would remain hidden until the cabin was discovered nearly 8 decades later, was that the message was not the product of delusion. It was a direct warning. Karl Reinhardt had been telling the truth the entire time. In the chaotic months following Germany's surrender, Allied intelligence teams sifted through mountains of captured documents, interrogation reports, and abandoned hideouts searching for high-ranking officers who had managed to escape. Names were systematically crossed off lists as fugitives were arrested, positively identified, or confirmed dead. Then there was Karl Reinhardt, an unexplained anomaly buried in silence. His file was massive, filled with conflicting witness statements. Stamped repeatedly with the same red ink, unconfirmed, Reinhardt had disappeared, without leaving the kind of messy trail that marked the escapes of so many others. Officers who were interrogated mentioned his name occasionally, always with uncertain language. He went into the mountains. He had some kind of backup location. He would never give himself up. But when investigators pressed them for details, their stories crumbled into contradictions. Some claimed he joined Werewolf, the rumored resistance movement that never grew beyond whispers and fear. Others swore he fled to Austria, traded identities with a wounded soldier, and crossed the border disguised as an ordinary farmer. Another theory suggested he was murdered by his own men after refusing to destroy classified documents. There was no consistency anywhere. No corpse, no reliable witness, no personal journals, no written letters. Just empty air. Allied command became increasingly frustrated. Intelligence analysts from MI6 and OSS exchanged reports that sounded more like folklore than credible information. Search teams were sent into isolated valleys, checking abandoned mountain shelters and ice-cold caves. They found nothing. Tracking dogs picked up no scent. No unmarked graves were uncovered. Even aerial reconnaissance photographs from 1944 and 1945 showed no unusual buildings in the areas where Reinhardt was suspected to be operating. His name kept appearing in post-war interrogations, each time with fewer concrete details. He knew too much, one captured officer stated before refusing to speak further. Another prisoner, shaking from exhaustion and terror, whispered that Reinhardt had mentioned a sanctuary that nobody else was allowed to know about. Allied officers dismissed these claims as the desperate fantasies of a dying regime. They treated the stories as pure fiction. Reinhardt became a footnote, an irritating mystery overshadowed by more urgent manhunts for notorious war criminals. Yet his name never completely disappeared. It remained present in classified intelligence reports, incomplete personnel files, and handwritten notes in the margins. Always circled, always unresolved. A man with access to the Reich's deepest secrets had simply walked into the mountains and evaporated, and that reality terrified everyone who was hunting him. Before he became a ghost haunting Allied intelligence files, Karl Reinhardt was something completely different. A brilliant mind hidden behind a military uniform. Years before the war began, he worked as an architect and engineer with a deep fascination for construction in hostile environments. Bunkers carved directly into mountainsides. Tunnels concealed by natural rock formations, reinforced hideouts disguised as simple shepherd shelters. This unique obsession eventually caught the attention of German military intelligence. They did not recruit him for his shooting skills or combat abilities. They wanted what was inside his head. Reinhardt's entire career changed in an instant. He was pulled into the intelligence world, a realm of classified files and confidential orders. He created encrypted communication stations hidden high in the Alps, Installations camouflaged so perfectly they became invisible against the natural terrain. He designed radio towers that looked like ordinary watchtowers, tunnels carved deep beneath ancient ice, supply depots concealed behind fake rock formations. With each secret project he completed, his security clearance expanded. Before long, he gained access to experimental weapons programs, encryption codes years ahead of their time, and classified escape routes created to evacuate officers if Germany collapsed. He toured research facilities where scientists worked on early radar technology and basic long-range jamming equipment. He examined documents about magnetic propulsion experiments and cipher machines meant to replace Enigma. He witnessed everything. The regime placed far too much trust in him. By 1945, Reinhardt had become one of very few officers who knew where classified mountain facilities were hidden throughout Bavaria and Austria, installations that even other intelligence operatives had no knowledge of. Some served as evacuation shelters. Others functioned as storage vaults for documents the Reich desperately wanted preserved. And a few, the most classified of all, were built as final refuge locations for people considered too important to lose. Reinhardt's level of access was so extensive, so unrestricted, that after the war concluded, Allied investigators quietly called him the architect of shadows. But here is what nobody could answer. No one knew what he did with all that information when the Reich fell apart. Because when Reinhardt vanished into thin air, he did not just leave with a backpack. He left carrying secrets that could reshape the entire political structure of the post-war world. And if he carried those secrets into the mountains alongside him, the truth might still be hidden there, waiting to be found. While Allied intelligence ripped through mountainsides searching for any sign of Karl Reinhardt, his family remained trapped in a small apartment on the edge of Munich, holding on to hope that refused to fade away. Marta Reinhardt had seen her husband for the last time in late April 1945, when he gently kissed her forehead, ran his fingers through their sleeping children's hair, and whispered softly, "I will return no matter what happens." But the war consumed his promise whole, leaving her alone with two young children. Anneliese, 6 years old, and little Tommy, barely 3, kept asking questions she had no way to answer. The weeks stretched into months. Letters stopped coming completely. Neighbors whispered sympathetic words behind closed doors. Still, Marta kept waiting. She studied every returning soldier who stumbled down the street, searched every crowded train platform, looking desperately for a face she recognized. None of them were Karl. Then, in late 1946, a postcard suddenly appeared inside the mailbox. No postage stamp, no sender address, just a brief message written in Karl's distinctive handwriting. "I am safe, nothing else." Her hands shook violently as she read those words. She held it against her face as if the ink might still carry his scent. But the card provided no hints, no address, no reason why he could not come home. Months passed before another message arrived. "Do not search." The words felt like ice cutting through her heart. She kept it hidden from the children. She could not bear to tell them. The third and final card appeared in 1948, a single sentence that stayed with her until her final breath. "This is the only way." Investigators examined the postcards carefully later on. Handwriting specialists argued endlessly, debated fiercely, compared every sample they could find. Some insisted they were authentic, perfectly matching wartime papers signed by Reinhardt himself. Others noticed problems with the pen pressure, slanted marks that suggested someone might have copied or memorized his style. To this very day there is no agreement. But Marta truly believed. She never married again. She kept Karl's uniform cleaned and neatly folded, kept his books arranged on the shelf, kept a candle burning by the window every single night. She raised 2 children on memories of a father who could walk through the door at any second. And those children grew up carrying unanswered questions that cut into their lives the same way glaciers cut through mountains. Was he still alive somewhere? Did he choose isolation deliberately? Or had someone sent those postcards to keep the real truth buried forever? By the mid-1970s, the name Karl Reinhardt had slipped into complete obscurity, locked away inside dusty archives and fading memories. But in isolated alpine villages, something unusual started happening. Stories began circulating over drinks at wooden tables, shared between shepherds and mountaineers, passed from climbers to hunters. Rumors, strange occurrences, things that had no natural explanation. It began with a hiking group near Zugspitze, who reported seeing smoke drifting upward from an isolated valley where no official trails existed. Not typical campfire smoke? Thin, constant columns rising steadily like intentional signals. When a park ranger checked the location days afterward, he discovered nothing except bare rock and total silence. In the early 1980s, two cross-country skiers came across a pattern of stones positioned in a geometric design pressed into the snow. A flawless circle of rocks surrounding a smaller triangle shape. The arrangement was far too intentional, far too exact to be created by animals or natural forces. But by the time officials reached the site, an avalanche had scattered the entire formation. Then came the account from a mountaineer named Klaus Brenner. He had been climbing solo during late winter when he noticed footprints. Deep, sharp impressions in untouched snow. But the tracks led absolutely nowhere. They ended abruptly at the edge of a steep cliff, as if the person had simply stepped off into empty space. Klaus filed a report about the mysterious tracks, but local authorities dismissed his claim as exhaustion-driven imagination. He refused to climb alone ever again. And the incidents continued. Experienced hikers insisted they heard faint mechanical humming coming from behind solid granite walls. Some reported catching brief reflections, metallic flashes hidden behind rocky outcrops. Others described doors carved directly into mountain surfaces that disappeared completely upon closer examination. Fear mixed with folklore began spreading. Village residents whispered about an old hermit, a shadowy figure spotted at dusk wearing a heavy coat and carrying a flickering lantern. Nobody dared approach him. Nobody attempted to follow. They feared whatever truth they might discover. And beneath all these strange tales, under the superstition and growing fear, one particular name kept resurfacing. Karl Reinhardt. The intelligence officer who had memorized every concealed corner of the Alps, the man who had spoken about a hidden sanctuary, the phantom that local hunters swore still wandered the high ridges long after he should have crumbled into dust. By the late 1990s, most professional historians had completely abandoned the Reinhardt mystery, writing it off as an impossible wartime disappearance consumed by confusion and passing decades. But one man absolutely refused to give up. Hans Volker, a lean, sharp-eyed investigative journalist with the relentless determination of a hunting dog, had devoted decades to uncovering the truth behind forgotten war stories. He was fixated on inconsistencies, on names that refused to fit into official records, and none captured his attention more than Karl Reinhardt. Hans discovered his first reference buried inside a worn file at the Federal Archives. One short paragraph typed quickly on yellowing paper noting unresolved disappearance, possible mountain escape route. That single mention was enough. From that exact moment, Reinhardt transformed from a ghost into something more. He became a challenge. Volker invested years crossing through southern Germany, knocking on doors of elderly officers, searching through village record rooms, interviewing old shepherds who still carried stories their grandfathers had shared beside crackling fires. Every rumor, every strange inconsistency, every unexplained detail seemed to point toward the same conclusion. Reinhardt had disappeared with clear intention, not from panic, not from fear, but with purpose. Hans gathered everything he could find: radio intercept records, interrogation documents, patrol logs, missing person files. Patterns started appearing, specific coordinates kept repeating. References to a sanctuary showed up in 3 separate witness statements from 3 completely different areas. He studied topographical maps until his eyes burned, looking for places that fit the vague descriptions mentioned in Reinhardt's final radio broadcasts. And slowly, again and again, one theory took shape. Reinhardt had constructed something. A shelter, a hideout, a survival cabin buried deep inside the mountains where nobody would ever think to search. Volker published multiple articles proposing that the officer had created a self-sustaining refuge in the Alps, attracting mockery from academics who labeled him a conspiracy theorist chasing fantasies. But Hans did not care about their opinions. He hiked alpine paths, explored forgotten valleys, and spoke with hikers who insisted they had witnessed unnatural structures. Smooth edges where nature should have created rough surfaces, rectangular shapes behind fields of boulders, metallic glints that vanished when people got closer. His office wall transformed into a massive collage of red strings, maps, newspaper clippings, and old black and white photographs. Friends teased him about losing his sanity, but Hans understood something deep in his gut. If Reinhardt had survived the war somehow, he had done it in a location he built with his own two hands. A cabin concealed so perfectly it would require decades before anyone accidentally discovered it. And Hans Volker was absolutely determined to become the person who located it. It was not Hans who discovered the cabin first. It was not even a researcher or a professional historian. It happened completely by accident in the summer of 2023 when two skilled climbers, Lucas Weber and Pia Grunwald, chose to explore an unmapped ridge in the Wetterstein Mountains, far away from established routes and guidebook suggestions. The ridge was dangerously steep, jagged, and unforgiving, the type of landscape only experienced mountaineers would dare to challenge. The weather changed without warning, pushing them to find temporary protection behind a massive pile of fallen rocks. That is when Lucas spotted it. A thin strip of darkness at the bottom of a boulder wall. Not a cave, not a natural opening, but a narrow crack, strangely straight, barely wide enough for a person's shoulder. Curiosity drew him forward. He cleared away a thick layer of debris. Broken stones, twisted roots, snow frozen solid into ice. And underneath it all, wood emerged. Old, weathered, precisely cut. A hidden door squeezed between rock and darkness. Pia's breathing stopped for a moment. She pushed a gloved hand against the wooden surface. It did not fall apart. It did not decay. It stayed solid, maintained by the freezing cold and shielded by the surrounding stones. Lucas discovered a corroded metal latch hidden beneath thick moss. When his fingers made contact, the entire world seemed to freeze. This was not a shepherd's simple hut. This was not a climber's basic emergency shelter. This was something completely different, something deliberate, meticulously hidden, built never to be discovered. They did not open it immediately. They did not have the courage. Fear mixed with wonder filled their eyes as they stepped back from the entrance, taking photographs, recording exact coordinates, and forwarding everything to authorities with shaking fingers. Within 24 hours, the location was cordoned off by Bavarian Mountain Police. Within a single week, historical researchers swarmed the ridge. And when the news finally reached him, Hans Volker sat inside his messy office, staring at the email containing the first blurry photograph. The ancient door surrounded by stone. He whispered just one word aloud. Found. The mountains had protected their secret for 78 long years. But now the entrance was exposed and everything was about to transform. When authorities finally unlatched the hidden door and forced it wide open, frigid air escaped outward like a breath released after 78 years of silence. Stale and completely untouched by daylight. The beam from the lead officer's headlamp pierced through the blackness, revealing a scene so remarkably preserved it felt like entering a different time period. The cabin was tiny, barely 3 meters across, carved straight into the mountain rock. The air carried faint traces of metal, wet stone, and something ancient. Dust floating motionless in time. Along the right wall stood wooden shelves bending under the mass of preserved food containers. Their labels were faded but still legible. Beans, pork, biscuits, ration cans marked with Reich symbols, arranged in perfect rows, completely untouched by bugs or rot. A metal-eating dish sat on a rough table as if somebody had simply walked away from an unfinished meal and never came back. On the opposite wall, maps were attached in careful sequence, yellowed, fragile edges beginning to curl. Balkan territories, alpine mountain passes, radio communication networks. Their corners displayed Reinhardt's distinctive handwriting, extremely thin pen strokes marking escape paths, concealed trails, and hidden supply locations. Below them, protected like precious artifacts in multiple layers of fabric, lay various weapons. A Mauser pistol, a small carbine, and ammunition boxes stacked carefully beside them. No rust visible, no damage from corrosion, just quiet preparedness. But the most stunning discovery waited on a short wooden desk. Notebooks, dozens upon dozens of them, fastened with cord. Their covers were discolored, edges heavily worn, but the pages were crammed with dense, encrypted writing. Symbols, numbers, patterns forming no recognizable language known to the investigators. Some pages displayed diagrams, structures built into mountainsides, air circulation systems camouflaged as natural fractures, escape passages nobody had ever recorded. Next to the notebooks rested an object that made even the most experienced officers stop cold. A handmade radio apparatus constructed from salvaged components. It appeared primitive yet operational, a transmitter assembled from recovered metal, wire coils, and vacuum tubes. Electrical wires stretched along the walls, vanishing into narrow openings. The device still produced a faint humming sound, as if some leftover electrical charge remained after decades of complete silence. Nothing suggested conflict or sudden disaster. No furniture knocked over, no evidence of fear, just existence interrupted. Everything was positioned with exact care, suspended in time. It appeared as though Carl Reinhardt had simply risen from that chair one night, walked outside into the freezing mountain darkness, and never came back inside. The cabin did not just contain physical objects. It contained clear purpose. And it felt like the walls themselves were patiently waiting to share a story nobody had been prepared to discover. It was hidden under a wool blanket on the small sleeping cot. Its leather exterior cracked and blackened by years of freezing temperatures. When investigators carefully opened it, the entire room became absolutely silent. The opening entry was dated May 2, 1945, exactly one day after Reinhardt was last spotted by witnesses walking the trail. His handwriting appeared precise initially, the pen strokes clean, steady, as if he truly believed he still controlled his own destiny. "I have left the unit behind," he recorded. "There is no command structure remaining to follow. No victory left to chase, only continuing survival." He detailed sneaking through the disintegrating front lines, observing soldiers fleeing like startled animals, listening to American artillery explosions echoing behind him as he traveled further into the mountains. He broke into deserted supply stations, collecting tools, food, replacement parts. He carried everything up steep rocky slopes, pulling metal pieces for the radio equipment he would eventually assemble inside the cabin. "The sanctuary is genuine," he documented. "I must arrive before sunrise reveals my position." His writing stayed logical throughout the initial weeks as he recorded the construction of the cabin. Drilling into solid rock, strengthening walls using cut timber, hiding the entrance below heavy boulders. The journal transformed into a detailed record of his isolation. But midway through the entries, something changed dramatically. The handwriting shifted, letters tilting downward, lines becoming irregular. His thoughts grew increasingly confused. "They are hunting for me," he wrote during June. "I hear them after dark, distant voices coming from below the ridge." There were no Allied patrol units recorded in that specific area during that period. Yet Reinhardt wrote with certainty, footsteps crunching on loose rock, whispered voices in the darkness. "I must stay completely hidden." Later, journal entries described unusual sightings, lights blinking behind rock formations, the constant feeling of being observed even during the deepest hours of night. He started arranging stones in specific patterns surrounding the cabin, creating markers only he could interpret. "The radio signals are too dangerous," he scrawled next to a drawing of his transmission device. "I only broadcast when thick clouds hide the moon." By August, the fear intensified dramatically. "Someone is getting close? They have discovered my location," he documented, describing hearing someone breathing just outside the door, shadows moving quickly between trees, figures standing motionless on distant ridges. But no footprints appeared when he went outside to check. The last entry was dated October 14, 1945. No closing statement, No final goodbye, just 3 terrifying words pressed so forcefully into the paper the pen almost ripped straight through. They found me. Then the writing stopped and every remaining page stayed completely blank. As investigators kept examining the journal contents, the initial entries showing Reinhardt's careful construction of the cabin slowly transformed into something much more disturbing. A gradual collapse into a mind breaking under the crushing pressure of fear, complete isolation, and overwhelming guilt. The handwriting transformed first. What started as sharp military precision slowly deteriorated into desperate strokes that ran together. Sentences breaking apart, words repeating themselves like sounds bouncing inside an empty cave. Reinhardt's growing paranoia was not immediate. It developed gradually, showing itself through small comments that became increasingly troubling as days stretched into weeks. "The Allied forces will kill me if they discover my location," he recorded. "There is no fair trial waiting for men who possess what I possess." He feared punishment not just from Allied soldiers, but from radical groups within his own shattered military organization. People who thought he carried information too dangerous to let him survive. "If they catch me, they will steal everything I have created," another page stated. The fear grew worse. Reinhardt documented hearing distant voices traveling on mountain wind, whispers sneaking through narrow gaps in the stone walls. "I heard them speaking my name," he wrote during one night in July. "Not human sounds, not natural wind, something entirely different. They are searching for me." He created small drawings in the empty spaces. Shadowy figures standing between the trees, stretched shadows falling across snow. "They wait for complete darkness," one note explained. "Their footsteps mirror my own." But when he ventured outside at sunrise, he discovered nothing whatsoever. No footprints, no noises, only complete silence. He described nightmares mixing with conscious moments, hallucinations of figures staring from high ridge tops, sounds of knocking on the cabin door when nobody stood outside. Some journal pages suggested the mental damage from war had finally shattered the controlled surface of the trained soldier. Other entries pointed toward something more primitive, the absolute terror of prey being stalked. In late September, Reinhardt documented, "I can hear breathing just beyond the walls. They stand near enough that I sense the air moving around them." He blocked the entrance with heavy stones, strengthened the walls further, and kept the Mauser pistol within arm's reach while sleeping. Nights merged together with terrible dreams until they became impossible to separate. And then came the final entry, written with trembling hands. Pushed so hard against the page the ink penetrated multiple layers beneath. "They have found me?" Following that moment, the journal went completely silent. No further explanations, no sense of resolution, just the raw, unfiltered fear of someone who realized his hidden sanctuary had been compromised. The discovery of the shallow stone burial site happened 2 weeks after the cabin entrance was forced open. Forensic teams carefully searched the nearby landscape, following maps and written notes recovered from Reinhardt's journal. A grouping of boulders positioned near a thin, rocky ledge attracted the attention of a mountain investigation officer. Stones positioned far too intentionally to occur naturally. When they cleared away the accumulated debris, they uncovered bones. Sun-bleached, fragile, placed with unexpected care underneath multiple layers of broken rock. For a brief moment, the investigators questioned if they had located an ancient burial site, possibly a shepherd or mountaineer from centuries past who died in the harsh elements. But small pieces of rotted fabric remained attached to the skeleton. Military wool, the tattered remains of a jacket, metal buttons stamped with markings from a 1942 German uniform. DNA testing verified what everyone had already suspected. The skeletal remains belonged to Karl Reinhardt. Yet every other aspect of the discovered remains created more mysteries than solutions. There were no visible gunshot injuries, no fractured bones, no blunt impact damage, no signs indicating any kind of fight. The teeth displayed natural aging, but no breakage or trauma. Forensic specialists eliminated violent death almost instantly. Instead, they suggested starvation, environmental exposure, or disease as probable explanations. But even those professional conclusions seemed somehow insufficient. The grave was not deep, clearly dug by bare hands, its borders crude and uneven. Somebody had spent time carefully stacking stones over the corpse, shielding it from wild animals. That reality meant one of two distinct possibilities. Reinhardt had sensed death coming closer and prepared a final resting location, or another person had buried his body. But who could that be? No additional human remains or preserved footprints from a second person existed anywhere nearby. No equipment or object suggesting someone else's involvement. The soil surrounding the grave remained completely undisturbed by passing time, revealing absolutely no answers. His skeletal remains seemed completely isolated, disturbingly alone. Forensic teams observed something particularly strange. His uniform had been positioned carefully, folded underneath his body, suggesting a deliberate action. Perhaps Reinhardt had organized his belongings methodically, finally surrendering to the mountain's deadly cold after months of complete isolation and declining mental stability. Or perhaps he continued believing he was being actively hunted until the very end, recording his final journal entry as a warning that would never receive any explanation. The official cause of death stayed impossible to determine. The truth about his final living moments remained permanently unclear. But one fact was absolutely certain. Karl Reinhardt never escaped those mountains alive. And whatever terrified him during his last days, whether completely real, purely imagined, or something existing between both extremes, he confronted it entirely alone. It was a forensic technician who initially detected the strange inconsistency in the cabin floor. A faint empty sound when his boot hit one specific wooden plank, a noise too unusual to dismiss. He dropped to his knees, swept away decades of accumulated dust, and carefully lifted the wooden board upward. What existed underneath sent a wave of nervous energy through the entire investigation team. Buried into the stone foundation sat 3 metal storage containers, each one secured with corroded metal clasps and marked, with identification codes that had not been utilized since the final months of the war. The boxes felt uncomfortably heavy, the metal surface freezing cold despite the motionless air trapped inside the cabin. When they were carefully removed and opened under strict supervision, the materials inside left investigators completely shocked. The first container held architectural blueprints, large, delicate sheets, covered with Reinhardt's precise handwriting. They showed structures built into mountain walls, some already documented in historical records, others never recorded anywhere. These were not typical military bunkers. They were completely self-sufficient installations designed to survive long-term siege conditions and maintain total secrecy. The second container held encrypted documents, multiple pages covered with code so incredibly complicated that even current-day analysts had difficulty breaking them. Long strings of numbers, letter groupings arranged in spiral patterns, sequences of strange symbols that looked like advanced mathematical equations. Some pages displayed the official stamp of high-ranking military departments that no longer existed anywhere. And then there was the third container. Inside it were research notes tied securely with leather binding straps. Reinhardt's experimental investigation files, detailed diagrams of radio transmission towers camouflaged as natural alpine structures, technical sketches of propulsion prototype systems, complex calculations involving magnetic field theories, multiple references to secret research divisions known only to a select group of officers. But scattered throughout the pages, one specific phrase kept appearing repeatedly, circled multiple times, heavily underlined, written hastily in empty margins. Operation Nebelhorn? Investigators stopped moving the instant they saw it. Nebelhorn, a legendary wartime evacuation strategy whispered about in hidden corners of intelligence communities. A strategy created to transport senior officers, cryptographers, and scientists to isolated mountain refuges if complete collapse occurred. On paper, the operation had never been real. Unofficially, Reinhardt's blueprints now prove something entirely different. The documents suggested multiple hideout locations, not just a single site. Installations carved straight into cliff walls, concealed beneath massive glaciers, reachable only through coded pathways. Some pages mentioned supply deliveries that kept arriving even after the war was considered finished. If Nebelhorn actually existed, Reinhardt had not been the only officer sent to this type of sanctuary. The cabin was not simply a personal hideout. It was connected to something much bigger, something that had been intentionally wiped from historical records. And the files hidden beneath those wooden floorboards were about to resurrect. Old secrets governments had desperately hoped would remain buried forever. The exact moment photographs of the concealed files reached Bavarian authorities, the entire nature of the investigation transformed. What had started as a historical discovery turned into a strictly controlled operation managed by federal organizations. Within 48 hours, officials from the German Federal Archives landed by helicopter, accompanied by uniformed officers whose identification badges displayed no units recognized by local police forces. International observers arrived shortly after. Historians, intelligence analysts, and forensic specialists from agencies that had no legitimate reason to be present. They established temporary command centers near the discovery location, their communications fully encrypted, their actions efficient and carefully planned. The media swarmed the mountain like hungry predators demanding immediate answers, but the official public statements remained intentionally unclear. Ongoing analysis, preliminary findings, no reason for public alarm. No photographs were made public, no documents were formally acknowledged, no reference to Operation Nebelhorn was mentioned. Hans Volker, the journalist who had spent half his lifetime investigating Reinhardt's disappearance, observed the press conferences with a dark, understanding look. He could identify government cover-ups when he witnessed them. For decades, he had pursued pieces of stories labeled as exaggeration. Underground shelter systems, secret evacuation procedures, disappeared officers who allegedly possessed too much sensitive information to risk capture. And now, at long last, somebody had located actual proof. Volker was not allowed on the mountain, but he maintained contacts. People who hated being silenced. And within just days he obtained a folder filled with low-quality photographs. Blueprints, encrypted pages, diagrams showing structures never previously recorded. He made them public. Within hours, the images flooded news organizations and social media platforms. Maps displaying specific coordinates, drawings of unidentified installations, pages marked top secret. His published article asked one disturbing question. What secrets did Karl Reinhardt die trying to protect? Government representatives rushed to attack his credibility, declaring the files incomplete and wrongly interpreted. But their defensive reactions only increased public suspicion. Why were specific agencies locking documents away before historians could examine them properly? Why were foreign intelligence organizations suddenly so deeply interested in a deceased officer's mountain cabin? And why were certain pages, specifically those mentioning Operation Nebelhorn, completely missing from official public statements, but clearly visible in Volker's released photographs? Behind locked doors, discussions became increasingly tense. Archive specialists whispered quietly that Reinhardt's documents referenced not just hidden sanctuaries, but actual personnel records. Names, officers, scientists, individuals who had disappeared just as completely as he had. And if those names became public knowledge, the accepted historical understanding of the post-war period might collapse in ways governments were absolutely not ready to handle. Publicly, they continued claiming everything was standard procedure. Privately, they kept classifying more documents. And somewhere within the confusion, Hans Volker finally understood the real truth. The cabin was not the final chapter of the story. It was the opening of one that powerful organizations had invested decades attempting to erase. With Reinhardt's skeletal remains finally recovered, his journals decoded as much as realistically possible, and the hidden files locked away behind multiple layers of government restrictions, investigators anticipated some form of resolution, but the cabin provided absolutely none. Instead, it created questions that chewed at the boundaries of rational thinking, leaving behind an emptiness that no official explanation could possibly fill. What exactly had Reinhardt been running from? His written notes mentioned Allied soldiers pursuing him, yet no military records document patrols anywhere near his location. He expressed fear of punishment from extremist groups. Yet those organizations were falling apart in total chaos, dispersed, running away, dying. And then there were the more deeply disturbing entries, the ones describing voices traveling through the wind, shadows shifting during nighttime, figures standing completely motionless past the ridgeline. Were those the mental breakdowns of someone deteriorating under extreme isolation? Or had Reinhardt actually encountered something or someone existing outside the scope of documented reports? The journal never provided clarity. It only became more panicked, more frantic. "They are approaching," he recorded. "They understand my location." But who exactly were they? The whispers he wrote about were never confirmed by footprints in snow or tangible proof. Forensic teams discovered no additional human tracks near the cabin structure. No evidence of other visitors, no equipment abandoned by any other person. He could have been completely alone, or perhaps the mountain eliminated others just as effectively as it eliminated him. Another impossible question hung over the burial site. Did he die completely alone? The deliberate positioning of his body implied careful intention. Someone folding his uniform underneath him, placing stones with thoughtful accuracy. But the idea that Reinhardt had somehow buried himself seemed completely impossible. Yet, if another person had completed the burial, that individual disappeared without leaving any trace whatsoever. No DNA evidence, no abandoned objects, no reasonable explanation. Then there were the classified documents. Operation Nebelhorn, the encrypted number sequences, the architectural plans of hidden refuges carved deep inside the Alps. If Reinhardt was not the only officer sent to such a facility, where are the remaining ones? Why were their identities completely absent? Why were some pages physically removed, substituted with empty sheets? Volker's released photographs suggested personnel records. Names covered so completely they vanished into solid black ink. And the government's responses, quick, secretive, aggressive, indicated the files held information never intended for public knowledge. Behind the classified security clearances existed answers that could potentially rewrite complete sections of post-war history. Evacuation strategies, missing military personnel, experimental scientific programs, and the strong possibility that Reinhardt's disappearance had been one small piece of something far more extensive than a single man escaping into the mountains. The cabin is now permanently sealed, the documents secured in locked vaults, the mountain paths erased by falling snow and passing time. And still, even after 78 long years, the complete truth about Karl Reinhardt's final living days stays just beyond reach, concealed in the darkness of the Wetterstein mountain peaks and buried inside classified government files the world may never be permitted to examine. This story was absolutely brutal, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.